joined by Akash Chougule, who is the Vice President of Americans for Prosperity. Akash, good morning. Got any questions you want me to ask J.D. Vance?
What I want to know from JD Vance is how this next administration plans to tackle the various fiscal challenges we are facing next year. The Trump tax cuts expiring, the debt limit deal, the ACA subsidies expiring. Spending is why we have an inflation crisis. We want to know how they're going to get it under control.
I will put that on the list, but that's pretty deep policy, Akash. I was going to go after the price gouging nonsense from Kamala. What do you think of that, by the way? What is she proposing in your mind? I think it's a nightmare. I think it means price controls, but she's doubled down on it. What is she talking about?
To be clear, Hugh, I'm not sure that she knows what she's talking about. What the American people need to know is that idea has failed every single time it has ever been tried in the history of the world. And that sounds very hyperbolic. It is absolutely true. It's been tried in socialist, communist countries all over the world and it has never worked because it breeds corruption, black markets, lack of supply. I mean, you need only look in this country at healthcare and higher education as two examples where the government dumps billions and billions of dollars into a system to try to improve it and make it more affordable. And what they end up doing is reducing quality, making it more expensive and more inaccessible for people who need those services. And they'll do the same thing to
Akash,
housing.
I worked for former President Nixon in his retirement in San Clemente, 1978 to 80, and then I oversaw the construction of his library, and I went back to helm the foundation for a few years. So three tours of duty with the former president or his foundation. And I know about price controls because Nixon tried it in 71, doubled down in 73. They were abject failures. And they had smart people working on it, like Bill Simon and George Shultz, and they had Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld. You cannot make price controls work because the market operates on bazillions of decisions by individuals, not on government bureaucrats. How many times do we have to learn this lesson?
Yeah, it's amazing, Hugh. Like I said, we have examples over and over again in history. And I think you make a very important point, which is that our economy functions on trillions of individual decisions made by individuals, families, businesses, meeting people's needs, deciding what they want, what they don't want. It is functionally impossible for unaccountable bureaucrats in Washington to micromanage the economy, no matter which party or how smart the person is who is president. It is impossible for government to micromanage the economy in that way. What's going to happen is ultimately we're going to see what's happened in California, which is that we're going to see housing prices go way up, price the middle class out, and you're ultimately going to see a shortage just like we have in other areas of our economy where this has been tried.
When Kamala Harris says, I want to give new home buyers $25,000, I think it's the worst idea I have ever heard because it is an inflation setting unnecessary jolt to the housing market. And two, it's not enough to do anything in most places where there's a housing shortage. What did you think of that proposal, Akash?
It, the other thing that's very ironic, Hugh, is that she's now talking about making housing more affordable when in fact it's her administration's policies that have made it so expensive to begin with. Housing was, to be fair, already very expensive, but look what they've done with this inflation crisis. Materials for housing are more expensive. Labor for houses is more expensive. The other inputs that you need are more expensive. Everything is more expensive because of this administration's inflation crisis, and that includes building and buying a home, Hugh. Pouring $25,000 per home buyer into the economy is only going to jack prices up even further. We know this idea is terrible. What I want to know, Hugh, is do Senate Democrats running for re-election, do they support this idea in their home states? Does John Tester think this is a good idea in Montana? Does Sherrod Brown think this is a good idea in Ohio? Bob Casey in Pennsylvania? Do they think this is going to make life more affordable for people in their states? I think we deserve to know,
Akash,
do they agree with this?
the media, our friends in the legacy media will never ask Bob Casey in Pennsylvania or Sherrod Brown or John Tester or Ruben Gallegos any of those questions. So it's up to us to educate. That's why AmericansForProsperity.org is a sponsor of this show. That's why they are in all of the swing states. Have you noticed an uptick in volunteers and people joining on with AmericansForProsperity.org, Akash, as we get into the home stretch here of 62 days to the end of the election?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There continues to be enthusiasm, and I think, frankly, Hugh, concern. I think the American people know that the biggest threat to the future of our country is full Democratic control. It's a Harris White House, Democratic controlled Senate, Democratic controlled House. We are active, like you said, in every swing state, making sure that these radical Senate Democrats who are running as moderates but voted for the failures of Bidenomics, have done nothing on the border, that they are held accountable. And yes, absolutely, we're seeing an increase in enthusiasm because they understand the threat that's at stake with a Democratic trifecta.
So if you're in a swing state or not, because you can also help in a swing state from anywhere in the United States by making calls, et cetera, go to americansforprosperity.org. Nonpartisan, but they are always in favor of whoever's in favor of a free market. Now, I want to go back to housing, Akash, because you know this stuff pretty well. The illiquidity in the market, the reason that there are not enough homes available for sale for first-time homebuyers is because during the Trump years, interest rates got to 2%. A lot of people are sitting on 2 to 3% mortgages, and they cannot move. The only way to get them to move up, as is traditionally the case, you buy your starter home, and then after 5 to 7 years, you buy a second home when you've got 2 babies, that, et cetera. That's not happening. We have a big wrench in the works because of that interest rate bubble, the consumption of houses under that interest rate. How do we get interest rates down?
We need to get spending under control first, Hugh. Interest rates are kind of a blunt tool to deal with inflation. I think people could cast blame on the Fed. I think some of that is fair, but ultimately it was a blunt tool to deal with the crisis of Congress and the administration's creation. I think until we do that, it's very, very unlikely that we see interest rates come back down anywhere close to where they were during the end of the Trump administration. I don't think it's realistic to expect 2.5% interest rates, but if we can get spending under control and get inflation under control, then I think we could start seeing rates tick down again to something even remotely more reasonable to make home buying more affordable.
The 10-year Treasury right now, on which most interest rates for home purchases are based, is at 3.81%. What do you think that ought to be in a healthy economy, Akash? I think it should be about 2.5% in a healthy economy.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's generally accepted, somewhere in the range of 2.5%. But again, so many things have been thrown out of whack, Hugh, and these numbers can get very complicated for the average American. But I think at the end of the day, they know things are more expensive. And I think the inflation crisis, what we're alluding to, is hitting people in more ways than one. Not only are day-to-day things more expensive, gas, groceries, things like that, but things that require credit are also more expensive. The ability to buy a home, the ability to buy a car, the ability to make these kind of capital investments, if you will, in your family that are integral to the American dream, right? They go beyond these day-to-day expenses. Those things are out of reach for people. I think that's very, very unfortunate. It's important to know why that's the case. Interest rates went up, these prices went up, credit card debt is way up because the Democrats, when they had full control, spent an additional $6 trillion supposedly to help the American people. Really, all they were doing was vote buying from their various sort of special interest constituencies, and the rest of us are left paying for it. I think they deserve to be held accountable for it, and Americans deserve to know the truth.
It was inflation dynamite. If you spend $6 trillion, if you print $6 trillion, the number of goods don't go up. Do you think this basic proposition is understood by voters? You cannot just spend money. We've always known that, but Joe Biden threw it out the window because he wanted to be FDR. Do you think the American people have learned we cannot do that?
I actually do think so, Hugh. You and I have talked about how hard it is to make the case to the American people on reckless government spending, but I think that problem has touched them more directly in the last four years or so than it has maybe ever, or at least since the era you're talking about, the 70s, the Carter era, things like that. But yeah, I think when we get to people's doorsteps all across this country, they get it. They see that, yes, maybe it wasn't the only issue. There were supply chain factors and COVID disruptions and things like that. But ultimately, it was the spending that dumped trillions into the economy, did nothing to increase supply. And that's why prices are up 20% since Biden took office.